is a vital part of development. It offers benefits such as an increased vocabulary, heightened empathy, and increased concentration, all of which make it essential for children. Thankfully, a day has been set aside to promote a reading culture and provide opportunities for children who may not have their own books. World Book Day is celebrated every March 6th, although it was originally celebrated on April 3rd, but the date was moved to avoid conflict with the Easter holiday and the absence of children from school. UNESCO officially established World Book Day in 1995 to recognize the power of books for cultural exchange and social advancement. World Book Day commemorates the anniversary of the death of two influential literary figures, William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes, who are traditionally observed to have died on this date in 1616. UNESCO officially established World Book Day in 1995 to recognize the power of books for cultural exchange and social advancement. World Book Day commemorates the anniversary of the death of two influential literary figures, William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes, who are traditionally observed to have died on the date in 1616. Today is also significant in Catalonia, Spain, where it coincides with Dia del Libro, or Book Day, a tradition involving the exchange of books and roses that began in the early 20th century. The day also aligns with the World Book Capital, an honor awarded each year to a city recognized for promoting books and reading. Additionally, it serves as a nod to Inga Garcilaso de la Vega, emphasizing the universal nature of literature. Books enrich our lives, foster education, and strengthen society. On this day, we celebrate not only books themselves, but also the book industry, publishers, and booksellers who make great reads accessible to all. World Book Day is an opportunity to introduce new books to students and celebrate past authors who have shaped our understanding of literature. School children often dress up as their favorite characters from books, and people are encouraged to donate to charities supporting children who can't afford books. While dressing up is a fun part of the World Book Day, the main goal is to encourage children to develop a passion for reading and explore the world of books available to them.
It's World Book Day. Like I asked before we went in the break, have you read a book this year? Do you intend to start reading? Now, the theme for this year's World Book Day is championing reading for fun. Can reading be fun? For some, it sounds like, how do you say reading is fun? We read because we go to school and then we're given textbooks for us to read. We just read because we have to pass exams. But really, if you ask me, there are fun books. What's our contribution to even the books that we read? How many African authors do we still have? How many African books publishing houses are still in existence? Well, let's talk to our guest on the show today, who is an author. She is Ejiro Umukoro. Thank you for being with us today on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation just prior to the book conversation. It just shows the power of how narratives, right, shape people. And the narratives come from what we consume. And when we consume literature that actually alters our way of thinking, shift our value system, and also give us a new set of beliefs, right? What happens is our mind incorporates this. We integrate it into our daily habits. It becomes a lifestyle, a culture, and it becomes what we are on a daily basis, what we do, what we say, how we act, and the things that we engage in. And that's just the power of how what we read, right? What we listen to can do to us as human beings.
To the conversation means that you're very enthusiastic about this. You're an author yourself. And we're talking about championing reading for fun and shaping the narrative or changing the narrative with good literature. Let me begin by asking a child growing up and reading books about different places in Nigeria, even before I got to travel to those places, reading about Onitsha and the busy environment, how it was a commercial hub at that time, reading books of the village happens there. You know, it just builds your imagination and it helps you get really into the African culture, and you're able to understand how what happens in communities that you've not even visited. Now, these days, what do you think is the situation? Do we still have books written telling African stories, helping young Africans to imagine themselves as Africans and also see what the way of life has been in Africa?
I think we have such books, and we've got Chimamanda Adichie. She's been doing fantastic in that realm, and some other renowned Professor Olusoyinka. Even though his books, people say they are old, but they are classic. I can read, and so for me, I grew up when you go to school and they have these comprehensive passages that you read. It has a way of grabbing your attention and you're looking at them, and I'm fascinated about the way a writer unfolds the story. Even when I start reading novels, the writer picks from different aspects of life, and towards the end of the book, they all converge to a specific point. And I'm wondering, the mind of a writer, how vast it is, how diverse it is. So those things moved me. When I walk back home, I've just been looking around the house, then I think it's a good culture for parents to keep books in the house. So I find books that my dad bought and kept at home. That was the first time I came across a book that I wrote. The theme was 30 years of military rule in Nigeria. And that was where before I was even taught about government in school, about our past leaders, the military coup, and what transpired in Nigeria, I first of all found that book in the house, and I was looking at them first, fascinated by the picture, then started reading things about the books, about the coups, the military administrators. I saw former President Olusegun Obasanjo, them. I looked very young, Yakubu Gowon, and all of them. And that's where I got attracted to government itself.
Okay, so our guest is back with us, Ejiro Umukoro, an author. Now, I was asking the question regarding African authors' participation in the writing of books, the publishing of books with African stories. How much of the participation do we still have now?
That's a very good question, and it's a good place for us to start this conversation on how reading for fun, which is actually the title of this year's World Book Day, is all about. While it is true that Nigeria especially suffers from a shrinking and expanding of the reading space, of the publishing space, because as we speak today, there's not one publishing mill in Nigeria, and that alone is shocking. That tells me that there is something about our government's disinterest in enabling an environment that actually supports the production of books, that is paper mills, for example. So if we don't have paper mills in Nigeria, and you're asking us from Nigeria to keep importing papers, right? Cardboard papers from overseas before they can get here and before a publisher can get to the printing press to publish books. We have a very fundamental economic ecosystem that is deficit. That is on the one hand. And that has led to what we have today, in which you look at the publishing industry, you have Cassava Republic, you have Narrative Landscape, you have Bookcraft, you have so many other publishing books, Masobe even, let me include them as well. These are people I've interacted with, and Lightre Media, that is the organization that also published my book, which is known as Distortion here. One of the things we decided to do was emphasize the significance of why we must begin to tell African narratives. I would say this for real. If you go to many schools in Nigeria and you look at the Ministry of Education and the criteria which they decide the kind of literature that they incorporate into the libraries and incorporate into the curriculum, there is no doubt that there's been a drop in the quality of it. But in more recent times, one of the things we have decided to do at Lightre Media is to say that, look, You have to give our young people high quality literature. You know why we discovered this? We did a survey, right? A very random survey for that matter. And we went around and interviewed young persons. And we kept asking them, how many African and Nigerian authors do you know of? Majority of them had no idea. Until after we pressed and pressed, some now finally remember, oh, okay, I asked them, what literature in school were you told to read? Whether they were compulsory, whether they were supplementary literature, it really didn't matter. But what literature did you read in school? And many of them came out to say, if they remember at all, this is out of 50 students, out of every 50 students, one person will say, okay, I remember Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And then I asked them, what is significant about that particular story? And they could not even say anything. They can't even remember the storyline. As powerful as that book is, that is read in over how many, in many languages, over 50 languages, I remember. And in many countries, that was a bestseller. And yet that tells me something, that we have a deficit of teachers who understand that reading is fun. Reading is something you show and model before young people so that they also imbibe and get excited into the vibe of why reading is fun. For someone like me, I started reading from when I was in my womb, more or less, because my father was reading to me while my mom was pregnant with me. And that was why when I was born, one of the things I picked, and scientists can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, I was very responsive to certain words, certain key terms. I reacted to them. And my vocabulary, by the time I was 5, was something else. Even at 3, they said I had a good command of the English language. I had a good command of my diction and all of that. And that was because I also grew up in a home where my father had libraries. And these libraries, interacting with them, I had a bigger vision of what life was about. I traveled to places I've never been to. I literally could feel people, taste the food they eat, smell the air they breathe in, all because I was exposed to the art of reading. And that's why when we were very happy to discover that the Delta State government, for example, is raising that standard to see to it that they, adopt high quality literature. And when they chose my book, Distortion, as the literature of study for students in the school, I was very impressed with that. I was so very impressed with that. And that tells us something. What does that mean? That at the end of the day, if the Ministry of Education doesn't sit up to do the needful, then we will not have the kind of quality education we need. We will not have the ecosystem, the business infrastructure, and the operations to run very successful publishing houses in Nigeria. But let me say this for real. There are Nigerian readers. The question is, where will they get the books? There are Nigerian authors. The question is, where are their books being sold? Where can we reach them? Like for me, I just decided that, okay, one of the strategies I can do to close that gap is to make sure that my books are not just only within my own space. I put them on Amazon, I put them on Seller, I put them on any spaces that people can, get access to it. But most importantly, I go to the audiences. We go there, we meet them where they are. And that's why this year we're hoping to start a very important conversation about, national reading culture, national reading conversation, getting young people to understand that books, public speaking, and academic performance are actually intertwined.
Okay, thank you. Today is World Book Day, and we hear phrases like, if you want to hide something from a black man, write it in a book. And someone had also argued that if you give a Jew $100, he will go to buy a book. If you give an African child $100, he will buy an ice cream. What's your view about the punitive kind of education we have here and its effect on the book culture? Because we seem to read just to pass exam, not just for knowledge sake.
I think what has happened is this, and it goes back to the home. I will always say it. Children model exactly what they see from the adults around them. And the adults around them can be parents, can be uncles, aunts, sisters, friends, neighbors, and all of that. So the question is, when was the last time your son or your daughter or your niece, for example, your relative saw you reading a book of interest? Do you sit down to have a conversation with your children? I'll give you a background to who I am also. When I was growing up, my dad had this habit of collecting newspapers and giving all of us, incidentally, we were girls, and giving all of us a book or a page of the newspaper to read. Now, each person will take a paragraph in the newspaper and then we will read it. And each paragraph, each child was expected to explain in their own words according to their level. It doesn't matter if the person is 5 years old or 10 years old. You were supposed to say what you think and understood from what you have read. And so we develop the habit of not only interest in reading, but critical thinking so that we can analyze literature, so that we don't swallow everything hook, line, and sinker. And that's why by the time I was 14, I queried everything that I was taught. I dumped every belief system I was ingrained with. I threw away every kind of ideas that were already put into my head. And then I realized it was from then I began to understand that when I began to read African literature, I began to travel through African histories and African books. That was when I realized that how could we have said somebody from European descent discovered River Niger? How can we have said that the only reason why we have a significance as a tourist people, that it has to be somebody from Europe descendancy? How can we have said to ourselves, right, that in celebrating this World Book Day, the only persons that are mentioned are actually of European origin? You're not seeing a conversation of African origin where our way of storytelling was actually very vocal. In other words, we were audio storytellers. We also have the griots back in Africa, and many of them are still existing today. Griots were an exceptional people. In fact, it was from the griots that the Europeans coined the word walking encyclopedia. A walking encyclopedia was one of those persons in African history, African culture, and tradition where they had the capacity to store knowledge and information here in the head. They can store hundreds and 1,000 years of information and pass it from one griot generation to the next griot generation. We lost that particular way of documentation and historical collation of facts. And when the Europeans came and did the damage they did, what we failed to realize is that by the time this transatlantic slave happened, the best of our people were already neutralized and destroyed. And so there was no handing over. To say that Africans don't read, or the best way to hide that kind of conversation is within a book, I think we insult ourselves even more when we perpetuate such narrative. I don't use that narrative in my conversation with people anymore because I know that it came from a space where somebody is telling you that the only measure of how you are intelligent is to make sure I hide something in a book. The question is, the treaties our ancestors signed in the 1300s and thereabout, those treaties, what language were they written? These treaties were written in English language, documented in paper that we could not read. Our ancestors signed that. And that was where this nonsensical narrative came from, where it said the best way to hide an information from Africa is to put it in a book. In other words, they wrote the language of business, the language of treaties, the language of the gentleman agreement where we used to have, and they changed and altered it. So it was not a language of business vocal communication anymore. It was a language of the business where I command, I use the pen and the paper and the language to subjugate you, to tell you and hide things from you. If I write something in a language that you cannot read and I ask you to sign that treaty, what have I done to you? I've hidden a secret. And so therefore, because I cannot read your language, I cannot even understand what you've written. Imagine writing that in a language I can read, no matter that, whatever that language is. You think you can hide any information from me? So when we make those kind of narratives, let us be very careful that you're also not perpetuating the idea of the conqueror, in quotes, take note, conqueror in quotes, who wants to dominate the narrative of the history. Because that's what we keep doing in Nigerian media space and in African media space. Because I just came from Kenya, where we had the African Media Festival. And one of the conversations we're having, and that is what I do, I also train, I mentor, and we run, spaces for how we can change the African narratives of how we talk about ourselves, how we talk about climate, how we talk about our beliefs that influences the decisions we make, the habits we form, the lifestyle that we have, and the choices that we make, and the lack of leadership that we should have. Because when we realize that as Africans, right, we are already blessed people. We are intelligent. There's no question about that. When you go...
How many volumes do you sell of your book in the continent? Any statistics?
Yes, so I have already sold over about 5,000 books, right? And I have not even started proper marketing. I have not started proper marketing. I've not even done adverts. I have not. And that tells you something, that when people understand the power of the book that you have, they will go for it, they will love it, and they will order for it. Do you get what I mean? So we should look at it from that perspective that, oh, you want to make an impact by the kind of quality of stories that you tell. And our stories, we outlast ourselves the more we push it in the eyes of our people. Our Nigerian media needs to do more. What can we do more? Bring all the African stories. You don't need to know the author. You just need to do your research, get some of these books that are well written, high quality literature, and just be throwing it out there for our young people. Create programs that emphasizes, right, the reading culture. I used to do something on radio when I managed a radio station as a Pioneer General Manager. And one of the things I did was introduce the idea of book reading, audio listening to books on radio. People thought that was it's not realistic, that people will not love it, especially in the environment in the Niger Delta where this was set up. And people were like, people don't like to read. And I proved beyond all reasonable doubt that people love to read. The question is, are you creating it in a format, in a manner, in a tone, and approach that people are willing to consume and love to be part of it? Need to see people calling on radio, parents bringing their children as young as 3-year-old, responding to quizzes on books. We read the books live for them on radio. I mean, we read it live to them, and then they listen.
Just pointed out that you tried to see if people would be open to audio listening of books or audiobooks, and worked in your experiment. So we're talking about African authorship now of books.
Okay.
Selling narratives about Africa. So there's a report that says that a large number of primary school pupils struggle with reading for comprehension. That's on one hand. And then when we look at the percentage of Africa, the percentage Africa takes in the global book market, as of 2019, Africa only has 1.4% of the global book market. That means that we have not even yet penetrated enough into the book market. Now let's look at technology. Technology has made it easy to the point where you have ebooks. So you can choose to have audiobooks. And you actually alluded to the fact that we are audio storytellers as Africans. Do you think that given the advantage we have as Africans being audio storytellers, we have taken advantage of technology enough to the point where we're able to penetrate the global book market using audio books, using audio stories?
So in Kenya and South Africa, the power of audio storytelling via podcast is a big deal. It is navigating a space where the Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas are loving it. So there's no doubt about it. What we're saying is this: if we want to control the book market, we need to understand the relevance of our story in the first place. 2, when people go for all these MFAs that they write for international media, that they go for it with international universities, for example, or fellowships that offer this kind of creative writing programs, what often happens to them is that the integrity of their voice, the integrity of the language they use, the integrity of the originality, right, of the nuanced conversation, the nuanced experiences they have that depicts Africa as Africa, or Nigeria as a Nigerian author, or a Kenyan, South African author, a Malawian author, is often removed because they are trying to feed the European audience, who have been encouraged over time and again to do what? To love reading. So they already have a culture of loving reading, and they never stopped at it. If the format required to change, they changed the format. Remember, the technology of writing was not so long ago. Back in the 60s and 50s, we knew parents who used to use the slate to write. Slate writing was a technology of writing. And then it moved to the chalkboard. From the chalkboard, it now moved to paper. Today, it's now on electronic spaces. So the question now is this: we need to retrain our teachers. The kind of teachers that should be doing things related to books, book reading, are teachers who love this and can create lesson plans from stuff like this. And we also need quality teachers who teach other subjects. Every subject is actually a subject of fun. But if we're not having our teachers, the right teachers who didn't come because they didn't have any other job, because the recruitment process of the kinds of quality of teachers we are accepting into our public and private schools are of great concern. I say this because I've also done investigative work where I went into town, I went to see private libraries, and I discovered that most of the private libraries in many private schools are not properly manned by experts. 2, Anybody can go there and market their book, and they actually buy those books. So the system of book accessibility to quality accessible books is also another conversation that we need to close the gap. And then the ministry, they should stop thinking of just being, doing things for photo optics. You will go and gather issues of children having difficulty with their academics. The reason why children are not excelling in the academics is because you are having the wrong set of teachers teaching a subject they have no interest in and are not committed to, nor do they have the passion for. And the children feel that, they sense that. And then they have this optics of, oh, let's celebrate World Book Day, let's celebrate reading culture. And it's all optics. They take pictures and it ends there. You don't see follow-up, you don't see budgeting. You will need to talk about the budgeting of books in reading and the education sector in Nigeria. How much of that budget affects the Nigerian space? So when you meet with commissioners, you meet with permanent secretaries, you meet with counselors in schools, all of them tell you that there is not enough
Ejiro, so this is my question. Let's assume that you are appointed the Minister of Education or probably the Commissioner of Education in any of the states in Nigeria. By way of policy initiative, what would be your advice to the government to initiate a policy not only to revive book reading culture in Nigeria, but to also revive it in a way that it will reflect in society where intellectuality will be the foundation and the driving force?
The old generation have gone. We're now with a new generation of digital natives. And because they are digital natives, they consume everything digitally. In other words, our school system, right? The nature of how study is happening within school has to change. The form of just using blackboards, right, to write is no longer tenable. Students' life attention span is very low. They need excitement. They need colorful presentation. They need engaging content, short bites that will get them going. And in the world where we live today, every subject that is taught cannot just be theoretical anymore. They have to be by mass. Mass means the children need to feel what they are learning. If they don't get in contact and engaged with that which they are learning, there will be no retention. And without retention, you do not have the increase in intellectual mass. And without intellectual mass, you do not have the critical capacity to think and query and have a conversation about a dialogue, for example, that you are seeing in a book. So one of the things we need to do is this. We need, as commissioners and as minister, I'm giving that privilege to be that in that space, to be a minister for education. One, we will begin again once to decide that the quality of the teachers needs revamping. People will be hurt by it. It will raise a lot of political dust. It will cause a lot of social discord and disconnection and conversation and all of that. The reality on ground is when you go to countries like Finland, where the moment a mother is pregnant, she is inundated, as it were, with lots of books to read. That is where we are going. We want teachers who love to read, who will support the reading culture and want that to be successful. And then another thing, libraries. Our libraries will now both be physical and virtual. Then we need book clubs. We need book clubs all over Nigeria so that children will see that there's fun in going to book clubs. When I travel overseas, I go to museums that are for books. We have a library in Abuja, for example.
Today on the show, we see that you have a lot of contribution towards improving the reading culture, not just in Nigeria, but in Africa. We wish we had more time, but one thing that you also mentioned is retaining the integrity of the vocal elements that would enable comprehension of African stories. And we know that that has to do with developing the back end and the literary markets to ensure that the publicists, the agents, the editors, and everyone who's involved in the production actually understand the African context and they can carry it through. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you didn't take anything out of today's show, two things you should take. One is that as an African, be proud of yourself, be proud of your skin. Do not have any form of inferiority complex. And to our African authors, the good works that you were doing before, we can do much more. We had great authors like Chinua Achebe. We still have so many great authors like Chimamanda Adichie, and one that we had on the show today, Ejiro Umukoro. So let's do so much more to ensure that we tell African stories. The agents that will need, the publishing houses, the production houses that understand the African context and can translate that for better comprehension of the stories so that reading can be fun. Let's ensure we do all of that and leave the theme for this year's Word Book Day, championing reading for fun. So we can do it as Africans. And this has been a show brought to you by an African media organization, Souk News TV, and the show is The Front Burners. Let's do it again tomorrow, 7 a.m. West African time. I'm Blessing Eichie. And from my fellow anchors, Dr. Dausa Osamanze and Krumale, what do you say?
Yeah, it's been a good day. I'm only challenging myself and those teachers that make school not fun at all. It was very punitive. You hear it today.
Long canes.
Umukoro is coming for you. See you tomorrow.
I am Oyinpreye. Krumale, good morning to you.